Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at the recently released PC version of Kojima Productions' Death Stranding, and see how it compares to the original PS4 version of the game released last year. For those of you unfamiliar with Death Stranding, it's probably one of the most unusual games to come out in recent memory. You play as Sam Porter, a courier who's tasked with piecing together the shattered remains of America by literally walking across it, delivering packages, and dodging creepy ghost-like creatures called BTs. If you're interested in learning more about the actual game, you can always check out the review I have linked below. But for today's video, we're going to focus specifically around how the PC version's presentation differs from what was originally a PlayStation exclusive title, and whether the changes are worth the double dip. For this analysis, I'm playing the PlayStation version of the game on the PS4Pro console, recording using a 4K capture card. And on the PC, I'm recording the game at my monitor's native 1440p resolution, with the settings pushed as high as possible and the motion blur setting disabled. Of course, even though PS4 Pro isn't natively running at 4K, its checkerboard technique can at times provide clearer images than a native 1440p resolution. So it's important to keep that in mind when looking at some of these side-by-sides. However, the focus for this video will be primarily on much more broad changes, like performance, general environmental complexity, lighting, character models, and a brief look at how the PS4 specific features have been adopted to work on the PC. Alright, so to kick this comparison off, let's begin by taking a look at our character models, starting with Mr. Norman Reedus himself. Now, there's two instances of this character I wanted to look at. Both the rendered cinematic cutscenes, which of course are a much higher quality, and the in-game model, using the recently released photo mode to get some nice close-up shots. From the first few cinematic cutscenes, it's difficult to really pull apart any distinct differences. The model itself is virtually identical in every way. However, upon closer inspection, we do see the benefit of that checkerboarded 4K on the PS4 Pro, with less aliasing when viewing individual strands of hair. But the texture that makes up his skin does appear more defined and clear on the PC, and with a 4K capable monitor, you'll be able to get the best of both worlds. But it's still interesting to see the advantages of the PS4 Pro's checkerboarding either way. When viewing the character in-game, the results are similar. A lot of times the PS4 Pro has a slightly sharper image output, but it all boils down to the resolution, and has nothing to do with the actual quality of the character model itself. Which is a real shame, as there are quite a few low-res textures and geometry along Sam's suit that I was hoping to see improved with the PC release. These same observations can be made with every character model in the game, with the same great facial mapping and animation quality in both versions, and it really doesn't feel like there's any benefit to these models on the PC. The environments, though, are where things get a little bit more interesting. After seeing negligible differences with the characters, I fully expected the environment to feature no noticeable changes as well. But right away, we can observe some distinct changes to the layout of the game world. You'll notice a ton more detail in this stretch of land here, with extra rocks and grass that aren't visible in the PS4. But before we go any further, I want to remind players who may not be familiar with this game that Death Stranding's world takes collective player data and uses that to slowly transform the environment as the player progresses further. So, if for example, thousands of players are constantly running back and forth across the same stretch of grass, it will eventually wear down and form a dirt path to follow. This appears to be exactly what has happened in these few examples I captured here, where you can clearly see several details completely removed from the world, likely due to the player stats suggesting increased activity in this particular stretch of land. However, I do find it interesting that this occurred at all. When comparing these games, I started a completely brand new save on the PS4, and so both of these captures are occurring at the exact same point in the game's story. I would have assumed because of this, the environment would have been reset to its default state. But I think what's more likely is that when you boot up the game, you're connected to one of many different servers, each with various environmental changes based on different pools of data. And because there's fewer players on the PC at the time of recording, perhaps the world just hasn't been carved out yet. Either way, it's pretty cool to see just how extensive this feature is, as I previously thought the social feature was limited to more obvious player-made structures like bridges and roads. But one thing that we can tell for sure is that the LOD has been increased a decent amount on the PC, with rocks in the distance featuring noticeably more detail than on the PS4. Object pop-in is also reduced a little bit on PC, meaning boulders and grass will render at a further distance, making it much less noticeable as you traverse across the wide open valleys. It's subtle, but it's one of the few actual visual improvements that are available in this version of the game. As for texture quality, there's very little difference between both versions. Any quality difference can be simply attributed to the output resolution. Next up, we have the lighting. Just like with the environment and characters, the lighting really hasn't changed all that much. Both versions sport the same nice global illumination, volumetric shaders and specular effects, and reflective properties like the screen space reflections seem to function the same, with no change to rendering distance or quality. The only thing that I found interesting about the lighting though was the coloration. For some reason, the PS4 version of the game during gameplay has a slightly more washed out tone than the PC. Now, my first thought was that maybe the brightness settings on the PS4 weren't set correctly, but they are set to the same default settings as the PC. And what's stranger, the cutscenes feature identical coloration between both versions, meaning it's only the gameplay that seems off. Of course, if you're planning on playing the game with HDR enabled, which I highly recommend, this won't be a problem at all, and the HDR quality looks the same on both titles. Next, we have shadows. Here's another one of the few areas where Death Stranding on PC does feature an actual improvement. The shadows now seem to feature a lot less dithering than before, and are more crisp, with the edges of Sam's fingers clearly visible, whereas before, they sort of blurred together. It's not a huge improvement, and considering the game is constantly shrouded in cloudy weather, it's not the most noticeable visual feature, but it's a bump to quality nonetheless. Now, let's take a look at a few effects, starting with the water. Now, the surface of the water, including lakes and rivers, looks exactly the same between both games. The PC version here looks a little bit sharper, but otherwise you'll see the exact same ripples and player interaction regardless of what platform you choose to play on. However, the one thing that does look a little bit different is the splash sprite effect that appears around the player when wading through rivers. The sprites themselves are the same, but because the PS4 forces the motion blur effect on at all times, the effect blends in with the surface of the water more seamlessly. Whereas without motion blur, the effect doesn't look quite as good, though it really just boils down to personal preference and you can turn on motion blur if you want. As for the crazy ink effects when triggering a BT event, the shaders and fluid simulation effects look about the same on PC. I noticed no improvements to the presentation, and everything seems to function as it should. But the incredibly smooth frame rate on the PC makes a night and day difference, which brings me to my next point, the performance. On the PS4 Pro, Death Stranding targets a locked 30 frames per second, which for a third-person action game is plenty playable on its own. But now, on the PC, Death Stranding supports frame rates well beyond 100 frames per second, providing a silky smooth presentation that makes even the disappointingly shadowed graphical improvements all worth it. However, the game's performance on PC does have one minor hiccup towards the beginning of the opening cinematic, where I noticed some significant stutter that doesn't appear at all in the PS4. I even noticed a friend who was streaming the game suffer from the exact same stutters at the same points. So this is likely an issue many PC gamers will encounter unless a patch is made available. Thankfully, this issue went away by the time I was able to actually move Sam around myself, and I never encountered a similar problem in the first several hours of gameplay, so hopefully it's just a one-off problem. Now, typically I like to feature a sound comparison at this point, but as both games have virtually the same audio, I'm instead going to play a few short clips that help to highlight just how drastically the performance improvement impacts the look and feel of the action. And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, Death Stranding on PC is the definitive version of this game. Sure, it doesn't support as many resolutions as other PC games, or even an FOV slider, but it retains everything that made the PS4 version of the game so visually impressive. It even improves on it in a few very minor areas. But most importantly, the game's performance is a huge improvement, allowing for more precise control and a superior presentation. The only issues I can really point out is the stuttering in the opening cinematic and the lack of an option to set the audio for BB to the DualShock 4's internal speaker. both of which are pretty minor gripes that can possibly be fixed with a future update. But what do you guys think? Are you happy with the PC release of Death Stranding, or were you expecting more? Let me know in the comments section, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos posted every week.